Hey everyone, welcome to this week's sermon. This week we are still in Matthew chapter 16, but we are moving on from Peter's confession to the last passage, the last part of the chapter, verses 21 to 27. But I'll start now with a quote from Rabbi Hillel, who is a rabbi probably a contemporary of Jesus, maybe a little before Jesus. And he said this: "If I am not for me, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" This is a quote from the Ethics of the Fathers, in Hebrew, Pirkei Avot. And it is a moment when Rabbi Hillel is trying to talk about the self. Who am I? What does it mean to be me? How am I supposed to live in this life in light of who I am and all the rest of it? Now, our passage also explores this question. What's intriguing is the way that our passage is actually translated, and it'll help us sort of get into this topic of how do we find ourselves? How do I have identity? Let's have a look at what Jesus is saying, and I want to focus just for this beginning bit on verses 25 and 26, and I want to show you something. So you can even have that with you right now as you're listening. But here in verse 25 it says this: "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" Now, you heard the word life there twice and the word soul there twice. But interestingly, in the Greek, it's all the same word. It's the word psyche. And psyche obviously comes from, it led to the words like psychology in English. And it's many times translated soul. And if we were to separate the psyche from the body, then maybe the word soul is a good translation for it. But it's really something much deeper than that. And Eugene Peterson, in his translation, The Message, which I'm sure many of you watching have, The Message is sort of, a paraphrase and it's wrong. But he translates this passage, the word psyche, as your true self. And the reason that I think that Peterson has got it right there is because that's really what Jesus is talking about. If you want to find yourself, you want to keep your life, you want to have your soul, you want to have who you are, then this is what you have to go through. So I actually think he's got it right. And he talks about the true self, and how we find ourselves and how we get to ourselves and what it means to have yourself there in that passage. Now, in modern day, it's very important to try and hold on to ourselves. We have lots of people out there trying to fill the spiritual vacuum of the modern world, especially the Western world, and people trying to explain how you find yourself, what it means to be yourself. So I think it's an important question for us to dive into and have Jesus speak to us on from this passage. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famous German pastor, and some might even call him a martyr. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book that in German he called Nachfolge, but in English is The Cost of Discipleship. Now, he spoke about this passage. And the reason that he wrote about this passage is because this passage, unlike many of the other things that we read about Jesus in the Gospels, this is one of the places that you actually see in every single one of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of them include this little conversation that Jesus has with the disciples. And when he says this, he writes about it, and he says, when Jesus calls us, he bids us to come and die. What is fascinating about what Jesus is saying is about how to find yourself, how to find your calling. What did it mean to follow Jesus? He focuses here on this passage because what Jesus is calling us to do is to come and die. And Bonhoeffer found it very central to how he lives as a believer in Jesus. And so I want to kind of explore that. Explore what Jesus is saying when he says, take your cross, which essentially means, walk up to the gallows, become a dead man walking, give up your life. Why is he saying this? What does it mean? What is he trying to get at when he calls us to come and die? Because it's provocative. It's not what you expect. Most religions have a prophet that tell you to go forth and to struggle and to strive and to find success, achievement, to find those deeds that you need in order to see yourself on into God's presence or to earn God's presence. But here Jesus doesn't. He says, come and die. And I want us to take a little bit of time to think about what that means. Now, we're going to do it in the context of this passage. And the passage begins with Peter's mistake. It begins with Peter's mistake. So I'll just read that beginning bit for you. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things, that the elders and the chief priests and the scribes suffer from them and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter is rebuking Jesus, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. So, and then obviously Jesus' rebuke, which is incredibly important here. He says, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Now, when we think of Jesus speaking to people, when he speaks to people that live on the margins, when he speaks to drunkards, to sinners, to prostitutes, he often speaks to them kindly. He calls them friend. He says sister, brother. He cares for them and speaks to them. When he speaks to the religious, however, he's harsh and will rebuke them. But never is he as harsh as he is with Peter right here in this passage. Here in this passage, Jesus almost gets to the point where he's cursing Peter. He really just rips into Peter in an incredible way. And not only does he do that, but this passage always comes after the confession. So Peter, as we said last week in the sermon, Peter comes and confesses. It is revealed to him who Jesus is, and he says, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God. And after this high point, one of the greatest compliments, Jesus says, you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and all the rest of it. Well, when he does that, Peter's like super complimented, and then he gets the harshest rebuke that Jesus gives to a person. And not only does he do that, but he does it in front of the other disciples. Remember, the context is he's talking to the other disciples. If you and I were to give somebody a harsh rebuke, in most cases we would take them aside, tell them like, this is really bad, one-to-one, face-to-face. But he does this in front of the disciples, and he rips into him. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why is Jesus doing it so harshly? And I think that the source of this is first of all, what Peter said in his confession. Peter spoke to Jesus and identified him as the Messiah and says, you are the Son of God. And throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Old Testament, we see mentions, a theme about God's Son. We see it, first of all, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. And if you're a Hebrew speaker and you go there, you might be confused. It's written in Aramaic. So you'll have to look at the translation for that bit. But we see the Ancient of Days standing, and then one like the Son of Man, it says. The Son of Man comes forward, and receives authority, receives honor from the Ancient of Days, right? And this divine Son is pictured there in the book of Daniel. We also see it in Psalm chapter 2, where God says, Nashku bar in Hebrew. He says, kiss the Son, honor the Son, right? The Son has to be honored there. That again, the divine Son who will go forth and rebuke the nations, overcome evil, overcome the world. This is the divine Son. And when Peter sees Jesus as the Son of God, he's identifying him with these passages in the Tanakh. But what Peter doesn't see is what Jesus is saying at the very beginning of our passage today in verse 21. He says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to overcome the world. I'm going to overcome all of these things through suffering and through death and through being defeated by the priests and the Pharisees and the scribes, these people that see me as a false Messiah. I'm going to let that all happen. And that is how I'm going to defeat the world. That is how I'm going to defeat evil. That is how I'm going to bring about salvation. But Peter doesn't see this. And Peter comes and says, no suffering. And the reason that Jesus gets so upset with him and calls him Satan is because what Peter is doing, and Jesus calls it in the Greek, he calls it a scandalon. He calls it a temptation. The reason that Jesus calls Peter Satan is because Peter is doing exactly what Satan did in the desert. When Satan said to Jesus, come, have this kingdom. Basically, bow down before me and you will earn yourself a kingdom. And there you can have it. No suffering, no difficulties, no trials. You can just have that kingdom if you will just bow down. And Jesus obviously turns away from Satan. And when he hears Peter saying the same thing, he says, no, Satan. That's exactly not right. Because what Peter needs to learn, what we need to learn, and what Jesus is trying to teach, is that in order to find the kingdom, in order to find ourselves, in order to move the kingdom forward, which is what Jesus is doing, we have to understand that the glory and the beauty and the wonderful things that God gives us comes with suffering. And we have to incorporate trial and suffering and difficulty into our conception of what it means to be happy and what it means to be joy, what it means to be with God. It's not just about the good stuff. Peter is, in fact, when he emulates Satan in this passage, is also emulating something that we're very familiar with. A Christian immaturity that we might be familiar with. Hang on a second, I believe in Jesus now, and so nothing bad will ever happen to me. I believe in Jesus now, and so I'll be healed when I pray. I believe in Jesus now, and so, it's all just love and hugs and worship time. But that's not what it is at all. That's not. We cannot leave the suffering and say, no, only Jesus did with that. No. Suffering is something that he dealt with, and in this passage comes to us and say, and because I went through that, and because that's how the kingdom goes forward, you too must incorporate suffering into your walk with me. And that is how you too will move the kingdom forward. That's how you will live this salvation that I have given you. That's how you will live it out, not according to what Peter has said. In fact, when he calls him Satan, what Jesus is saying, and this is harsh, he's saying, you don't get to represent me. You don't get to talk about me. You don't get to evangelize in my name if this is what you're going to say. If you're going to take suffering out of Christianity, if you're going to take suffering out of what it means to follow the Messiah, then you have no part. Don't do it. That's wrong. It's false. To talk about Jesus is to talk about his suffering and to talk about our call to follow him until the day that he redeems the world. There is a funny cartoon film, and you guys know I love cartoon films, called Ants. It's an old one now. The reason it's very funny is because the protagonist, the main character, is played by Woody Allen. And at the beginning of the film, you see Woody Allen talking to a shrink, talking to a psychiatrist, which is very classic New York Jewish. So he's there in the room, he's talking to the psychiatrist, and he says, I guess I feel insignificant, right? And he's an ant, right? And the camera you see next to to where he's sitting there talking. You see all the ants all walking around the hive, and he's just one of, millions. And the psychiatrist says, progress, you're making progress, well done. And he says, why would you say that? And he says, because you are insignificant, right? You're an ant, you're insignificant. And the entire movie, you see Woody Allen's character trying to be him. He's like, I'm gonna be me, I'm gonna show everybody how to be me, it's all gonna be about how to be an individual. And it's compared to, the rest of the ant hive, the rest of the ant family, where everyone's just like, no, you're just who you are. And it's comparing two very well-known sort of ideas of self that we see in the world today. The first one is the traditional or more Eastern idea of who we are. And that is, we aren't individuals, we are part of a we, right? The call in the East is to lose yourself. You're not Yoel, you're not Adele, you're not Boaz, you're a Ben David. And Ben Davids do what Ben Davids do, and we're part of, that's our tribe, and that's who we are. Buddhism emulates this as well, and just sort of moves it forward into the philosophy of Buddhism, which is, there is nothing. There is no you, you're just part of the one reality, the one. And you just have to give up yourself, give up your individuality. That's a lie, that's not true. You just have to be part of the one. That's the way the East would push it. That's the way the East would show, would tell you who you are. You aren't an individual, you are part of something, and you just have a job within that whole. The West, however, on the opposite end of the spectrum, says no, I have to be me. It's all about being me. Do what's right for you, do who you are. W.H. Auden, comically, I think, in one of his poems, writes, "Oh, miserable, wicked me, how interesting I am." And we're fascinated with who we are. We're fascinated, that's probably why all of this is interesting to us, because I want to know who I am, and how do I find me? And if I can't find me, then I'm lost. Where do I belong? What am I? Who am I? And we tend to do that by looking into ourselves and by wanting to express ourselves. And we do that by often finding our feelings. There was a pastor once who wrote about how this lady came to him and said, you know what? I just have to break away from everything. Why? Because I have to live out my feelings. I have strong feelings and I have to live with them. And she went out and she did that, came back one day and said, I found a problem. And this is the problem with feelings, that they run dry. I have really strong feelings, but then they peter out, and I want to do this one thing and I do it, but I have to do more of it and more of it and more of it to keep getting back to that feeling, which is what I wanted, which is what I thought was guiding me. But in fact, it just ends up being this need to sort of affirm that feeling that ends up just pittering out and becoming nothing. And then the other problem with feelings, obviously, is that they conflict. I sit in front of a big piece of cake and I want to eat the whole cake, and that's my feeling. But at the same time, I also, want to live beyond the age of 50. And if I want to do that, then, what feeling am I going to go with? So feelings conflict and feelings run dry. Going with just the individual ends up turning us around and leaving us nowhere, in the same way that losing ourselves, and here's the one that the losing ourselves, the traditional view that we often find also in the West, is we lose ourselves for someone else. That is, I lose myself for my spouse, I lose myself and just look after my parents or just look after my kids, and I lose myself into them, and then I find myself again empty and with nothing. And Jesus comes and he says, yes, you need to lose yourself, but you need to lose yourself for me. What Jesus is doing is he's calling us into a relationship with him, where as we lose ourselves, we find ourselves in him. And as we suffer and as we go through difficulty and we go through trial, we find ourselves. Why? Because we've moved the kingdom forward and we have identified with him. And his story becomes our story. His identity becomes ours. And we connect with him. And in that, we find our true selves, because that is who we were created to be. Now I'm just going to give you a couple basic applications of this. The first one is self-knowledge. So to have a strong identity, to really find myself, I need to know myself. I think everyone would agree that you need to know yourself in order to have a strong identity. And what Jesus is saying in this passage to that is, in order to be able to really know yourself, to see you, you need to know his suffering first. You need to understand that you are forgiven and that you are loved, and he has given everything for you. Because only when you know that you are eternally loved can you finally actually look at yourself and see yourself as you are. If you've been a believer in Jesus for a while, you'll know this, because it's only as you've grown in your faith, only as you've come closer to him, that all of a sudden you discover your sin. You start seeing your sin. You start seeing your messed up ways and how screwed up you are more and more. And that's you finding yourself. But God only wonderfully, graciously, only shows us those things as we come to know him more. But you wouldn't be able to handle it. You wouldn't be able to receive it, believe it, if you saw yourself as you truly are without knowing that you were loved and you were forgiven. Because we're messed up. Because we're all screwed up inside. And it's only with his love that we can know ourselves. And so you can only truly know yourselves by knowing Jesus and by walking with him. Second, also learning to not be controlled. To have a strong identity, you need to not be controlled by certain parts of society, family, friends, work, the news, to not be controlled by what other people want to tell you about you. Hey, you're like us, you're like this, you're like that, you should be like this, it's cool to be like that. You need to be with him. Have you ever had this period of your life where you've said, you know what, I don't care what other people think. The only person who matters is me. It's what I think that matters. What other people think doesn't mean anything. And I've said that many, many times in my life. And because I get fed up. I'm fed up with people, I'm fed up with everything, and I just want to push them away, and it's all just about me. But the truth is, I say that in my frustration. But when I actually try to work that out and live that, I don't do that. I just move away from one group of people and I start becoming like other people. When you're younger, you're like, I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to be live like them, talk like them, look like them. I'm just going to be me. But you don't be you. What you end up doing is you end up, moving to the fashionable end of the town, buying yourself the clothes that everybody else buys, drinking the expensive coffee that everybody else drinks, You do that and you end up just identifying with another group of people. And in the passage, Jesus says, what are you going to do? Give up your soul to try and get the world? That's what we do. We give up ourselves and try to be like something else in the world. We don't want to be like us. We don't even know who we are. So we give that up. And we end up being either like our parents more, or we start being like our friends, or we start being like some other group of people. And we try to switch our identity from place to place. And we never actually find ourselves. We give ourselves up in order to be like other people, for other people to think that we're cool, or to be like the people who we think are cool. But Jesus in this passage says, no. If you want to find yourself, then you have to get to this point, and this is unbelievable, but getting to the point where the only opinion that matters is Jesus. Only when we give all of that up, we give up the world, we give up what everyone else thinks in order to believe and choose to only want to care about what Jesus thinks of us. Only then can we actually find ourselves. Only then can we be safe enough with him to find ourselves. And to be ourselves and to be who we are, to be who he created us to be in him. Only then will you be able to find yourself. And then finally, there's self-knowledge, not being controlled. And then finally, purpose. We find ourselves when we find our purpose. And again, that's going to involve this suffering. That's going to involve giving things up. It's going to involve going the way that we believe Jesus wants us to move for the bettering of his kingdom. That means I give up the great job that really, really pays me well in order to go and do the job over here that pays me less. But over here, I can do more for the kingdom rather than over there. It's the, and it could be through giving. It could be in many, many different ways. I could sacrificing my evening to go and help people instead of having the evening for myself, or doing something for somebody else. So giving up for the kingdom and having that purpose, there we find ourselves. Only in those moments will we say, this is what God brought me here to do. And in that, I am me before him, which is where I'm supposed to be. Brothers and sisters, if you are watching this and you're a believer in Jesus, you are probably suffering, just like me. And in your suffering, I just want to suggest two things to you. In the cross that you're carrying and the difficulty that you're trying, don't forget to compare your cross to his cross. Don't forget to take your suffering and to look at him on the cross while you're carrying yours, and to think about that. And as you compare that, it will allow you to be able to see your suffering in proper proportion to what suffering truly is as it is reflected on the cross of Jesus. And secondly, if you're in a place where you think to yourself, why must I suffer like this? Is there any meaning to this suffering? Again, as you cling to his cross and you see the meaning of Jesus' suffering, you should know that he has never left you and that there is meaning to your suffering. And he is going to show that to you now or later, but there is meaning and you are suffering for a purpose. Why? Because that's why Jesus died. Not to relieve you from more suffering, but to make all of your suffering purposeful as you find yourself in him. And if you are not a believer in Jesus and you're watching this video, I want you to ask yourself, why are you interested in Christianity? Because if you're interested in following Jesus because you think that in Christianity or in church, you can find the things that you're looking for, or maybe God will give you your desires and what you want out of life will come because you start following Jesus. I just want to let you know that's never going to happen. Jesus is not going to give you those things that you want, because those things that you want right now are nothing in compared to what he will give you, because he will give you himself. And that is more beautiful and more valuable than anything you can possibly imagine. God bless, guys.